Shalom. We're going to study this week's Parashat Vayishlach today. In previous weeks, we discussed in passing the advent of Yaakov and Esav. This week, we'll get more into that relationship. I'd like to say from the outset that Esav and the representative nation of Edom, who received their name from him, like all the other Avot, eventually Esav had a new name. But unlike Yishmael, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and Avraham, who were given names that had to do with godly matters, Esav was named by his brother because he was hungry for some red stuff. And Edom means the red one, and that's what his nation came to be called. The nation that came from Yaakov came to be called Yisrael, for having bested the mighty, or bested God's angels even. Esav was not necessarily a reject in God's eyes, like all the other personalities we discussed until now. For example, Yishmael was actually kicked out of Avram Avinu's house, and the Bnei Keturah were sent out, and there are others who were not chosen. A reading of the psukim between the lines, and also reading a few Midrashei Chazal, tell us that perhaps Esav had greater potential. Perhaps Esav could have been something more than what he ended up. Perhaps Esav did not have to be the progenitor of the Amalekites. The Amalek was one of his grandchildren. Obviously not all of Esav's children fall into that category of Amalek, only a specific group. But be that as it may, Esav had the unfortunate distinction of being the ancestor of these Amalekim. What happened to Esav? Esav had certain midot that brought him off the derech. A popular pulpit rav in the United States, and now a foremost educator, a Rosh Yeshiva, taught us many years ago that when you have a sermon to give on Shabbat, you have to make it draw the people. And he mentioned an idea he had for a specific sermon for this time of year concerning my twin brother Esav. What's my twin brother Esav? Yaakov Avinu had a twin brother Esav. Now, most of the time in Tanakh, we don't hear when people were necessarily twins. We happen to know that Peretz and Zerach were twins because the story of their birth was actually significant. But there could be more brothers mentioned in Tanakh, and because it was not necessarily to record it, we don't know if they were twins or not. Most likely they weren't, but there could have been other twins. We just don't know that they're twins. Esav and Yaakov did not have to have their story of their birth recorded. We could have known that Esav was older than Yaakov, and that would have been enough. But the Torah specifically says that there was difficulty in the pregnancy, and that Esav ended up being born first, and Yaakov was pulling on his heel. This teaches us something. What? That Yaakov, who we all strive to be like, Yaakov is the ancestor of all the Jewish people, and the word Yisrael, his later name, is also a halachic term for a Jewish person. We don't say a Yehudi necessarily in halacha, we say a Yisrael. Someone who's a regular Jew is a Yisrael. Yisrael has a twin brother Esav. That means that we can all see ourselves as having this potential inside of us. If we are good Yisraelim, we have to know that we could have ended up just like Esav. We have a twin brother Esav. Or we have to look at fellow Jews who are not necessarily keeping all the Torah, they don't keep all the mitzvot. They are twin brothers, and we have a certain responsibility for them because Esav and Yaakov are ultimately brothers, and they're twin brothers. They were, as my Rosh Yeshiva put it once upon a time, they were chavrusas. Why was Esav trying to leave? And why was Yaakov trying to leave? Esav wanted to get to the Avodah Zarah, but why was Yaakov necessarily trying to leave if he's learning with the Malach? The angel teaches everybody the entire Torah in utero. And the answer he gives in jest was, because Yaakov didn't like his chavrusa. He was stuck with Esav. But be that as it may, we all have this potential. We all have this in our lives all the time. We have a twin brother Esav, someone who could have ended up just like us but did not. Or we could have ended up just like them and we did not. And we have to watch out for them. We have to learn from them. We have to look out for them. We have to care for them. We could perhaps bring them closer. Esav came to be like I said, the progenitor of not only the Amalekites, but also a whole nation of people who ended up actually being quite similar to the Jewish people. Their homeland became the area that's now to the southeast of what's the populated areas of Israel. Nowadays it's not populated, but it used to be more. It's an area just beyond the Israeli border in the country of Jordan. People every year on the 1st of Av, people cross over into Jordan, to the land of Edom, where historically was, where Aaron HaKohen's burial place is, traditionally, and we still know where that is. And the nation of Edom existed as an independent entity, a known entity, with whom sometimes we had wars or alliances, sometimes competition, for the most part of biblical Jewish history. And even though the sages said that eventually this entire land of Edom, which eventually was called in the European languages Idumea, they even came into the land of Israel. They started occupying the empty lands of Shevet Yehudah after the first destruction, and they proceeded almost as far north as Hebron. And in the times of John Hyrcanus, Yochanan Hyrcanus, who was the first of the Maccabean monarchs and the second or third in their line of those who actually were the rulers of the Jewish people. He was a nephew of Yehudah Maccabee, that would be Judas Maccabeus. He forcibly converted all these remaining Idumeans to Judaism. And since then they ceased to be an independent group politically and socially and religiously. They were all converted to Judaism, and they've been among us. That's on the assumption, which is the Chazal deny, that they were actually all ethnic Edomians, ancient Edomians. Why would Chazal say that? Because there were many conquests, especially the Assyrian conquests in the centuries beforehand, during the times of the First Temple, which basically, they say, made it so that the populations of places around the land of Israel, specifically Aramea and the eastern side of the Jordan River, Ammon and Moab, and even parts of Egypt, those are no longer the Egyptians. They're mixed up already in with the other nations. There was depopulation and repopulation and population transfers, so we can't rely on the fact that we can't rely on the assumption that those Edomians already in early Second Temple times were the children of Esav, even though they might have had a significant portion of them as such. And even we read in this week's parasha how these pure descendants of Esav actually had a lot of intermarriage and mixing with the previous population there. In the land of Seir, there was the Seirites. It says Seir the Hori. The Hori is the group of people who used to live there, and they're sometimes called, when they lived in the land of Canaan proper, the Chivi. So this group of Canaanite admixture became one and the same with the Bnei Seir, with the Bnei Edom, the children of Edom. So already there wasn't such clear lineage there. And for most of history, we see that there's this conflict, the prophesied conflict between the Jews and Edom. Yet, there's also a concept, and this is stated most explicitly by Moshe Rabbeinu, no less, in the books of Bamidbar and Devarim and Numbers and Deuteronomy, that the Bnei Esav are our brothers. That's how he even gives a salutation to the king of Edom. He says, Ko amar achicha Yisrael, so said your brother Israel. And he also described how we passed through the land of our brothers, the children of Edom. And there's even some halachot that assume that Bnei Edom are treated differently than other Gentile groups because they are our brothers. It's also interesting to note when we talk about slavery and servitude, when, for example, the Israelites were in Egypt, they were called Hebrews. And when we talk about a Jewish person who's sold into indentured servitude for his debts or for his crimes, so he's suddenly called an Ivri, a Hebrew. And even though, yes, we are all Hebrews, and Abraham was a Hebrew and that's our language, we don't call ourselves that. Like I said earlier, we call ourselves Jews nowadays. Halachically, we are all the Yisraelim. But when someone is in servitude, he's a Hebrew. Strangely enough, this Hebrew term actually incorporates also children of Esav, Edomians. And that's a halachic nafkamina. Today it's practically not a nafkamina anymore. There's a halachic practice. There is no, we don't know of anybody who's an Idumean or an Edomian. But once upon a time, this did matter. And the Bnei Esav, unlike the other groups that surround the land of Israel, we don't know necessarily what form of idol worship they had, what their culture was like. We do know that they spoke a Hebrew similar to our ancestors. Culturally and religiously, they were close to the Bnei Israel. And that's why Moshe Rabbeinu refers to them as brothers throughout the Torah. And this conflict, or this tension, continues. There are times in the era of the kings where Jewish kings conquered the land of Edom and controlled it, and the king of Edom was actually a puppet of the Jewish kings. And, as per the prophecy, when the Jewish people became not deserving, the Edomians were able to rise up and revolt and regain their independence. And that's the way it was for quite a long time. This week's Haftarah is from the book of Ovadia. It actually is the entire book of Ovadia, which is not its own book. It's one of the books of the 12 prophets, and the sages did not consider its own independent book, even though for our intents and purposes might as well be one independent book. And they identify this Ovadia with the same Ovadia mentioned as being the head of the household of King Ahab. And they say that this Ovadia was a convert, and like the Ovadia mentioned with Ahab, was very God-fearing, and he earned a prophecy about his native land of Edom. And that talks about the destruction of Edom and eventually a Jewish conquest thereof. And the sages took this, eventually, in a point of history, when there was no longer an Edom that had this complicated rivalry/brotherly relationship with the Jewish people. They transferred a lot of the ideas, these midrashic ideas, these ideas that come out from between the lines in the Chumash, and these ideas in the prophets concerning Edom. They transferred them. What do I mean? If there is no longer an Edom, there's no longer an ethnic group Edom, and we certainly know there's no longer any Canaanites, there isn't any Amalekites for whom we can perform the commandments that are specific to them. It's basically an irrelevancy nowadays, and it's been irrelevant since at least Maccabean times. So what are we to do with all these concepts? And the sages saw that these ideas could be transferred to the ancient Romans. Now, someone who studies history and studies also what we've read in the book of Bereshit and Genesis up until this point, studies them hard, realizes that the ancient Romans were not related to any of the ancient peoples who we have mentioned in the Bible, except maybe they're descendants of the Kittim and Dodanim, somewhere in the line of Japheth, who's the oldest son of Noach. There's no connection between the Romans, or the Greeks for that matter. The Greeks are mentioned in the early Bible. They even come before Avram Avinu, but there's no mention of the Romans. But eventually, the Roman Empire, which at the beginning was an ally of the Hasmoneans, it says Judas Maccabeus even had a treaty with the Romans for help against these Syrian Greeks. These Romans fit a lot of conceptual matters that pertain to the rivalry/relationship between ancient Israel and ancient Edom. The Romans were originally allies, and they came to dominate the land of Israel. They were even responsible for the destruction of the Second Temple. And for many years later, there was ensuing centuries of Roman domination. There was a Bar Kokhba revolt almost a century after the destruction of the Second Temple. And there was more years of on and off persecution, the Hadrianic persecutions immediately after the quelling of the Bar Kokhba revolt. And then there was the times of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and some of his children when relationship was actually good between the surviving Jewish community in the Galilee and their Roman overlords. And there was even an emperor, Julian the Apostate, who in, I believe, the 4th century permitted, while he was still alive, the rebuilding of the temple, which the Jews enthusiastically began until he died, and terrible things happened that sort of prevented the Jewish people from fulfilling this dream of rebuilding the temple. And the sages saw that, and they applied all of these conceptual teachings now, because of lack of the Esav, who's actually descended from Yitzchak Avinu, who's actually related to us, they applied it to the Roman/Judean relationship. Eventually also, because the church, the Christian church, had its base in Rome, and eventually when it split, Constantinople was the Eastern Roman Empire, Rome was the Western Roman Empire, the sages saw the relationship between what came to be known as Judaism, our faithful religion, and an offshoot religion which originally started among Jews. Christianity started among misled Jewish people, eventually became a majority Gentile religion, and most of the leadership and the adherents of Christianity were Romans, people in the Roman world. So the sages, the late sages, and later the Talmudic era and also in the Gaonic era, applied these concepts to the relationship between the Christianity and Judaism, much like they would also take the relationship between Yitzchak and his children. Remember, Kivi Yitzchak yikarei l'chazara. God said that he was choosing Yitzchak over Yishmael. Avraham's legacy would be through Yitzchak, but be Yitzchak, only some among Yitzchak, not all of Yitzchak. So among Yitzchak, only Yaakov was chosen, not Esav. Just like Esav became the representative of the Christian world and the Western world as an extension, Yishmael, even though he was not the forebearer of what we today know as the Arabs, Rambam says, they're mostly others, Bnei Keturah and others, Yishmael came to represent Islam. And the greater Muslim world is the Ishmaeli world. And the language of Arabic, Rishonim refer to that as the language of Ishmael, even though it's not actually. They applied these concepts and this idea between the conflict between Yaakov and Yitzchak and their true belief in God with these rival religions that start with certain basic biblical principles that they got from us, of course, and then they divert and they digress and they sort of lose things in the translation. Literally, they translated it to their own languages, and they call their languages the holy languages, etc., and they believe that we're no longer the chosen ones. Of course, that's nonsense, but the sages saw that these relationships between Yitzchak and Ishmael, that conflict that we mentioned earlier, and this conflict between Yaakov and Esav represent these other religions and worldviews. This doesn't take into account the entire Eastern world, but at least for our Western world, Jews who lived in Christian Europe or the Muslim lands in Africa and Western Asia, so they saw teachings. They saw how to understand how we should relate to our Muslim or Christian neighbors through the teachings of the sages that had to do with Yishmael and Esav, and even poetically until the 20th century referred to Yisrael as the Jewish people, and Esav is the Christian world, and Yishmael is the Muslim world. And that's the way it has stood until this point. It's lav dafka, as they say in Gemara terms, but it's actually a pretty convenient model that we can use, which is why we should just clarify. Esav is not literally the ethnic father of the Romans, or all the Europeans for that matter, just like Ishmael is not the father, the actual father of all these Ishmaelites, of all these various Arabs in the Arabic-speaking world. God willing, one day, this is the bright side to it, Maimonides writes at the end of his great work that one day all of humanity will come to worship God and realize the mistake of their ways, the error of their ways. And the advent of Christianity and Islam has, there's a silver lining to this big cloud, this big gray cloud. Silver lining is that beforehand everybody worshipped sticks and stones. They were pagans, they were strict idol worshippers. And now most of the world that we live in has heard of these concepts, the basic concepts of ethical monotheism and scripture and messianic ideal, utopian worldview. All of these things are our ideas that when the truth comes out and when the Messiah comes and the knowledge of God will fill the world, people understand that everything they've heard until now, well, most of what they heard now was nonsense, but there is a kernel of truth, and they'll understand the kernel of truth, and it'll be easier for them to come to the complete realization of how to serve God properly. They're putim about this. This is the messianic ideal we strive for, that one day all mankind will come to worship God. They'll all gather in Zion. Today, even though the Christians have their own holy cities and the Muslims have their own holy cities, yet they claim that our holy city is also holy to them, one day they'll realize that no, those aren't holy cities. There's only one holy city. It's our holy city, but they're just as welcome to join us in prayer there, like this prophet said, as long as they recognize that fact. God willing, we should have a Shabbat Shalom, no more wars. This should be the first Shabbat of a new Messianic era, God willing.